A runway looks like the safest place in aviation. It is flat, it is familiar, and it is right there. But when things go wrong on a runway, they go wrong at full speed. There is no altitude to save you, there is no time to recover, and sometimes the danger is not in the sky at all. It is already waiting on the pavement. In this documentary, we count down the 9 worst runway disasters in aviation history: collisions in fog, wrong runways in storms, abandoned landings, and more. Welcome to Terra Obscura. If you want more calm, detailed aviation documentaries like this, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. It is March 27, 1977 at Los Rodeos Airport on Tenerife. A small island airport suddenly becomes overcrowded after a bomb threat at Gran Canaria forces wide-body jets to divert. Ramps are full, taxiways are blocked, and heavy fog starts to roll across the only runway. On the ground sit 2 Boeing 747s, KLM Flight 4805 and Pan Am Flight 1736. Both should have been on their way to Gran Canaria. Instead, they are stuck on a short, foggy field that was never designed for this much traffic. Because the taxiways are jammed, the tower tells both aircraft to use the runway itself for taxi. KLM is told to backtrack along the runway, turn around at the far end, and line up for departure. Pan Am is told to follow the same runway, then exit via a taxiway, and clear the strip before KLM takes off. In clear weather, this plan is tight but workable. In thick fog with no ground radar, it is a trap. KLM reaches the far end, turns around, and lines up on runway 30. Visibility comes and goes as low clouds drift across the pavement. The captain is one of the airline's most senior pilots, under pressure from duty time limits and delays. While they are still holding in position, the crew receives their route clearance for the flight to Gran Canaria. It is permission to follow a certain route after takeoff, not permission to start the takeoff itself. The wording on the radio is not perfect. The tower uses the word takeoff while giving the route. Almost at the same moment, Pan Am transmits that they are still on the runway. The two transmissions overlap and block each other. Inside the KLM cockpit, the captain hears enough to believe they are cleared. The crucial parts, including the reminder that Pan Am is still on the runway, are lost in the noise. The KLM captain pushes the throttles forward. The jumbo begins to accelerate into the fog. Far down the same runway, Pan Am is still trying to find its taxiway exit. In the cockpit, they are counting intersections in near-zero visibility, trying to match what they see with the airport diagram. They know KLM is somewhere behind them, but they do not expect a full takeoff roll yet. Then through the fog, the first officer suddenly sees lights racing toward them. In the KLM cockpit, the flight engineer is the last voice of doubt. He asks if the Pan Am is clear of the runway. The captain answers firmly that it is. By the time anyone realizes the truth, the aircraft has already passed the speed where a rejected takeoff is safe. On Pan Am, the captain shoves the throttles forward and tries to turn left off the runway. It is too late. On KLM, the captain pulls back early, trying to lift off and pass over the other jumbo. The 747 lifts just enough for its nose to clear, but not its underbelly, main gear, and engines. The two giants collide in the fog. KLM's fuselage and engines tear through the upper right side of the Pan Am cabin, ripping it open. Fuel spills and ignites. KLM stays airborne only a moment longer before crashing back onto the runway and exploding in a massive fireball. Everyone on board the KLM aircraft dies. On the Pan Am jet, fire races through the broken cabin. Only 61 people, mostly in the forward section and left side, manage to escape through holes and onto the wing before flames and smoke make the interior unsurvivable. In total, 583 people are killed. It becomes and remains the deadliest accident in aviation history. Tenerife changes how the industry talks and listens. Standard phraseology is tightened. The word takeoff is banned from most radio calls until the exact moment a controller issues a clear, unambiguous takeoff clearance. Ground radar becomes a priority at busy airports. Crew resource management training starts to focus on junior crew speaking up when something feels wrong, even in front of very senior captains. All of those changes trace back to one short runway on a foggy afternoon, where 2 aircraft that never left the ground still produced the worst disaster the jet age has ever seen. TAM Flight 3054 was supposed to be a short, routine hop that ended with people stepping out into the heart of Sao Paulo. Instead, it became Brazil's deadliest aviation accident and one of the worst runway overruns in history. On the evening of July 17, 2007, an Airbus A320 left Porto Alegre for Congonhas Airport in Sao Paulo. On board were business travelers, families, commuters who flew this route all the time, plus the crew who knew Congonhas well. The airport sits on top of a hill in the middle of the city, with short runways and busy streets and buildings right at the edges. The weather in Sao Paulo was ugly but not extreme. Heavy winter rain had soaked the runways. Congonhas had long been criticized for poor drainage and short landing distances, especially when the pavement was wet. In the cabin, though, it just felt like another bumpy descent into a busy city airport. There was another complication that most passengers did not know about. One of the Airbus's thrust reversers on the right engine had been deactivated in accordance with maintenance procedures. Flying with one reverser inoperative is allowed, but it demands extra care. The crew are supposed to set the throttles in a specific way after touchdown, so that the working reverser on the left side helps slow the airplane, and the right engine does not keep pushing it forward. As Flight 3054 lined up to land on runway 35, the runway was wet and slick, with patches of standing water. The Airbus approached slightly fast and touched down long, closer to the middle of the runway than the beginning. That already ate up part of their stopping distance. Still, with correct use of spoilers, brakes, and thrust settings, a safe stop was possible. In the cockpit, the crew moved the thrust levers after touchdown, but the positions were not symmetrical. The left lever was pulled back into reverse. The right lever, for the engine without a working reverser, was left close to the climb setting instead of being brought to idle. To the airplane's computers, this meant one engine was trying to help slow the aircraft while the other was still delivering power. On a wet, short runway, that was a deadly combination. From the passenger seats, people felt the impact of landing, then an unusually strong push as the airplane failed to slow properly. Instead of the hard, steady deceleration you expect after touchdown, the A320 kept charging forward. Outside, spray flew up from the wheels. Anti-skid brakes were working, but the wet surface reduced their effect, and the thrust from the right engine kept the jet moving faster than it should. The end of runway 35 left came closer with every second. The pilots realized something was very wrong and tried to regain control, but the distance was almost gone. The Airbus ran off the far end of the runway at high speed. There was no long safety area, no open grass field, just a steep drop, a busy avenue and airport buildings directly in its path. The aircraft crossed over the perimeter, plunged down the slope, broke through a wall, and slammed into a TAM cargo building and a fuel station just beyond the airport boundary. The impact was massive. Fuel ignited immediately. A fireball engulfed the building, the aircraft, and vehicles nearby. People in the terminal buildings and on the streets saw an orange glow and thick black smoke rising above the hill. Inside the airplane, there was no real chance. The forces of impact and the intense fire meant that all 187 people on board were killed. On the ground, 12 more people in the building and surrounding area lost their lives. In total, 199 people died. It was the worst accident in Brazilian aviation history. Investigators looked at every possible angle: the weather, the condition of the runway, the aircraft systems, and the crew's actions. They confirmed that the thrust reverser on the right engine had been deactivated, as recorded. They also confirmed from the flight data that during the landing roll, the right thrust lever stayed forward near climb power, while the left lever went into reverse. Spoilers did not deploy fully at first, and the airplane never truly transitioned into a full symmetrical deceleration. They also examined Congonhas itself. The runways were short for the amount of traffic and weight they handled. Grooves that help drain water had been removed during resurfacing and had not yet been fully restored. On a rainy night with a long touchdown, the margin for error was incredibly small. The official report pointed to a combination of factors: a high and long landing on a wet runway, the asymmetric thrust lever position after touchdown, and the physical limits of a short city center airfield with almost no room beyond the pavement. Human factors in the cockpit, training on operations with one reverser inoperative, and the airport's drainage and safety layout all came under criticism. On the night of October 31st, 2000, Taipei's main international airport was being battered by the outer bands of a powerful typhoon. Heavy rain, strong gusts, and low visibility turned the airfield into a confusing blur of runway lights and reflections. Singapore Airlines Flight 006, a Boeing 747 Jumbo, was getting ready to leave for Los Angeles with a stop in Taipei. There were 179 people on board. By the time they pushed back, the crew had already been dealing with delays and a long working day. Everyone on board wanted to get into the air and away from the storm. At Chiang Kai-shek Airport, there were two parallel runways, runway 05 left and runway 05 right. That night, runway 05 right was closed for construction. It had piles of concrete, construction vehicles, and barriers placed along it. Only runway 05 left was open for takeoff. On the charts, that was clear. On the wet ground, in driving rain, it was much harder to see. Flight 006 was cleared by air traffic control to taxi out and take off from runway 05 left. The crew followed the taxi instructions as best they could in the poor visibility. The airport did not have full stop bar lighting or advanced ground radar like many big hubs use today, and some of the painted markings were hard to read. Out of the cockpit windows, the pilots saw taxiway lights, then runway edge lights, all smeared by rain on the glass. They turned onto what they believed was the active runway and lined up. In reality, they had lined up on runway 05 right, the closed strip full of construction equipment. The open runway, 05 left, was still a short distance away. On the flight deck, The instruments could have shown that something was wrong. The exact position on the airport and the expected taxi route did not match, but under pressure from the weather, the schedule, and the simple desire to leave, the cross-checks were not as strict as they needed to be. The tower, working in the same bad visibility and without modern ground radar, could not see the aircraft clearly. Controllers believed Flight 006 was where it was supposed to be. They gave takeoff clearance. The crew advanced the thrust levers. The 4 engines of the jumbo surged to take off power. The aircraft began to accelerate, rain streaming along the fuselage, spray kicking up from the wheels. In the cabin, it felt like any other rough-weather departure. Engines loud, runway lights flicking by faster and faster, passengers pressed into their seats. Halfway down the closed runway, trouble was waiting in the darkness. Ahead of the aircraft, parked along the center of runway 05 right, were construction vehicles and concrete barriers. In clear daylight, they would have been impossible to miss. In this storm, in the dark, with the nose lights cutting through sheets of rain, they only appeared in the last seconds of the takeoff roll. By the time the crew saw shapes on the runway, they were already close to rotation speed. At that speed, a heavy jet cannot simply stop within the remaining distance. The captain tried to lift off, but there was not enough runway left and not enough time. The nose of the jumbo managed to rise, yet the main gear and engines were still low. The aircraft slammed into the first line of construction equipment. One engine and part of the wing were torn away. The impact ripped open the lower fuselage. Fuel spilled and ignited. The airplane broke apart and slid down the runway, pieces of wreckage scattering into the storm, fire erupting on both sides. Inside the cabin, the violence was sudden and extreme. Seats tore loose, overhead bins blew open, lights failed. Passengers near the front took the brunt of the impact and the immediate fire. Further back, some sections of the cabin stayed briefly intact, giving people a chance to escape. Flight attendants and surviving passengers opened usable exits and scrambled out into the wind and rain, some climbing down onto torn wings, others onto the broken pavement, with fire and black smoke behind them. 83 people died in the crash, most of them in the forward part of the aircraft where the impact and fire were worst. The rest, including crew and many passengers seated further aft, survived with varying degrees of injury. For them, the images that would later be seen on television, the burning remains of a jumbo on a stormy night in Taipei, were not distant. They had walked and crawled out of that scene themselves. When investigators went through the data, the cause was not a mystery. The aircraft had taken off from the wrong runway. The deeper question was how that could happen at a major international airport. They found a combination of factors. The closed runway still had lights that could easily be mistaken for an active strip in poor visibility. Signage and markings at key taxiway intersections were inadequate or confusing. There was no effective barrier across the closed runway to make it physically impossible for an aircraft to line up on it. Low visibility procedures on the ground were not as strict as they should have been. In the cockpit, the crew did not cross-check their position, and heading against what the instruments and charts would have shown for runway 05 left, and there was no strong challenge when doubt might have been raised. Out of those findings came changes that spread far beyond Taipei. Airports improved their markings and lighting for closed runways, added bright X markings and physical barriers, and upgraded ground radar that shows controllers exactly where each aircraft is on the field. Procedures for low visibility operations became tighter. Crews were reminded to always confirm that the runway they see outside is the same one the instruments show, especially on dark, wet nights when everything looks the same. Singapore Airlines Flight 006 is now one of the classic examples taught in runway safety courses. On paper, it is described as an attempted takeoff on the wrong runway during a typhoon. In human terms, it is the story of a jumbo jet accelerating into the night, with everyone on board believing they were on the correct strip, while heavy machinery waited invisibly in their path just a few hundred meters ahead. It is the morning of October 8, 2001, at Milan Linate Airport. The weather is the kind pilots hate on the ground. Thick fog, visibility so low that the end of the taxiway disappears into gray. On one side of the field, a Scandinavian Airlines McDonnell Douglas MD-87 is preparing to leave for Copenhagen. It will later be known as the SAS flight in this story. On the apron, passengers sit strapped in, listening to the engines start and feeling the aircraft begin to move. They cannot see much outside, just a smear of lights and mist on the windows. Somewhere else on the airport, a small business jet, a Cessna Citation, has just landed from Germany and is now taxiing out for a short hop to Paris. 2 pilots and 2 passengers are on board. They have never been to Linate before. Their airport chart is cluttered, and the markings on the ground are not as clear as they should be. Painted signs are worn. Direction boards are confusing. In this fog, every taxiway looks like the next one. The tower has a problem too. There is no working ground radar at Linate that day. Air traffic control, known as ATC, cannot see where each aircraft actually is. Controllers have to imagine the layout from voice reports and rough timing. In good visibility, that is just about workable. In fog that hides everything beyond a few dozen meters, it is a serious weakness. The citation crew receives a taxi clearance. They are told to follow a specific route and hold short of the main runway. On the paper chart, the route looks simple enough. On the wet concrete, with centerline lights and markings fading in and out of the fog, it is not. The crew misidentify a turn. Instead of joining the taxiway that leads safely parallel to the runway, they enter another path that points directly toward the active strip. In the tower, the controller believes the citation is where it should be. The pilots report passing checkpoints, but nobody cross-checks them with radar or with clear visual sight. There's no red stop bar light to physically tell them they are about to cross a protected line. The airport layout, signage, and procedures all assume better visibility than they actually have. On the runway end, the Scandinavian MD-87 has lined up for departure. The crew receive their takeoff clearance. They advance the thrust levers. The engines roar, and the heavy jet begins to accelerate through the fog. From the cabin, there is no sense of danger. Just the usual push back into the seat and the blurred centerline lights streaking past. Downfield, the citation is edging slowly forward. Its pilots do not realize they have moved past the point where they were supposed to stop. In the fog, the runway does not look like a runway. It is just more gray concrete ahead. They cross the holding line and roll out onto the active strip, right in the path of the accelerating airliner. The two crews cannot see each other. The controller cannot see either of them. There is no last-second shout, no warning to stop. Only the flight data recorder will later show how close this moment is to the end. As the MD-87 approaches rotation speed, the captain begins to pull the nose up. The jet is almost ready to fly. Then the crew see something dark appear in the fog directly in front of them. The citation. There is no room to steer around it. There is no time to stop. The nose gear lifts, but the main gear and engines are still on the ground. At more than 250 kilometers per hour, the MD-87 plows straight into the smaller jet. The impact tears the citation apart and rips one of the engines and parts of the landing gear off the Scandinavian aircraft. Debris and fuel spray across the runway. The MD-87 is still moving at high speed, but now badly damaged. It cannot climb. It struggles into the air for a brief moment, loses control, and crashes back to the ground beyond the runway. The jet overruns the paved surface, smashes through the airport fence, and slams into a baggage handling building on the other side of the field. Inside that building, ground workers are on duty. They have no idea that a fully loaded airliner is about to burst through the wall. The impact and the fire that follows kill everyone on board the SAS aircraft, everyone on board the citation, and 4 people working inside the building. In total, 118 people die. In the hours and days after the accident, the fog lifts, but the questions remain. Why did the citation end up on the runway? Why did nobody in the tower realize it? Why did the SAS crew have no chance to avoid the collision? Investigators discover a series of familiar problems. The airport charts are confusing. Taxiway names have changed, but not all documents match. Painted markings on the ground are worn and hard to read. Some taxiway intersections are missing stop bars or clear signs. There is no functioning surface movement radar to track aircraft in low visibility. Radio phraseology is loose and does not always follow international standards. The citation crew, new to the airport and under pressure, misinterpret the instructions and turn onto the wrong route. The controller assumes they are where they are supposed to be, and nobody has an instrument that can prove otherwise. The result is a textbook runway incursion in the worst possible conditions. One aircraft cleared for takeoff, another aircraft unseen, sitting sideways across the same runway. After Linate, the reaction is strong. Italian authorities and European regulators demand upgrades to ground radar at major airports. Taxiway signs and markings at Linate are rebuilt and standardized. Low visibility procedures are tightened. The use of stop bars and runway guard lights is expanded. Phraseology is cleaned up so that instructions to cross or hold short of a runway are unmistakable, especially in poor visibility. American Airlines Flight 1420 was the kind of flight that should have ended with people rolling their bags into a quiet, small terminal and going home to bed. On the night of June 1st, 1999, an MD-82 left Dallas for Little Rock, Arkansas. It was a late flight with a lot of tired passengers and a tired crew. By the time they neared Little Rock, the day had run long. Thunderstorms were building right over the airport. Out the windows, passengers could see lightning and sheets of rain. In the cockpit, the weather radar was full of red and yellow. As they descended, air traffic control warned them about storms near the field and changing winds. The crew had options: hold, wait for the worst of the weather to pass, or divert to another airport. Instead, they chose to continue and try to get in before the line of storms hit the runway. It became a race between an airliner and a thunderstorm. On final approach, the airplane flew into heavy rain and strong gusts. Visibility dropped. The runway lights faded in and out behind the wipers. The approach was not perfectly stabilized. Speed and configuration were still being adjusted low to the ground, at a height where a go-around would have been the safer choice. In the cabin, People felt turbulence and could see almost nothing outside except flashes of light. The MD-82 broke out of the worst of the cloud with the runway ahead, but they were high and fast. The captain pressed on. The jet touched down, long, well past the ideal aiming point, on a wet runway with standing water. That meant less room and less grip than the numbers on paper suggested. After touchdown, more things went wrong. The spoilers, the panels on the top of the wings that kill lift and help put the weight of the airplane onto the wheels, did not deploy properly at first. Reverse thrust on the engines was applied late. For precious seconds, the MD-82 rolled on a slick runway with too much speed, too little drag, and not enough braking. Anti-skid brakes were working, but water under the tires reduced their effect. The airplane did not slow the way it should. From the cabin, the deceleration felt weak and then almost absent. Outside the cockpit windows, the far end of the runway rushed closer in the rain and darkness. By the time the crew fully realized they would not stop in time, there was no distance left to fix it. The aircraft ran off the end of the runway at high speed. Beyond the pavement there was a small overrun area. Then the ground dropped away toward the river levee and a line of approach light structures. The MD-82 left the concrete, plowed through the soft ground, smashed into the metal light towers, and broke apart. The fuselage split. The front of the airplane was badly crushed. Fire broke out around the wreckage. Inside, the impact was violent. Seats tore free, overhead bins opened, and the cabin filled with smoke and confusion. Some passengers were trapped. Others found themselves near breaks in the fuselage and emergency exits that still worked. Flight attendants and survivors opened what doors they could and helped people out onto the rain-soaked grass and levee, with emergency vehicles struggling to get close through mud and debris. In the end, 11 people, including the captain, lost their lives. More than 130 survived, many with serious injuries, but alive. For a late-night domestic flight into a small city, the scale of the damage was shocking. An airliner broken beyond the runway, tangled in lighting structures at the edge of a river. Investigators found no single hidden mechanical failure that caused the crash. Instead, they found a chain that is now very familiar in runway disasters. A crew under time and fatigue pressure. A thunderstorm sitting on top of the destination. A decision to continue an unstable approach instead of going around. A long landing on a wet runway. Delayed deployment of spoilers and reverse thrust at exactly the moment when every meter of stopping distance mattered. Pegasus Airlines Flight 2193 was one of the most ordinary flights in Turkey. An evening hop from Izmir to Istanbul Sabiha Gökçen on February 5, 2020. The airplane, a Boeing 737, approached Sabiha Gökçen while a line of thunderstorms and heavy rain sat right over the airport. Air traffic control was using runway 06, pointing northeast. The problem was the wind. It was blowing mainly from the west. For arrivals on runway 06, that meant a strong tailwind on a very wet runway. 2 airplanes before Pegasus, 2193, had already gone around after unstable approaches. As Flight 2193 descended through the rain, the crew was warned about the weather and the winds, but they continued the approach. Flight data later showed that the 737 was not fully stabilized in the last part of the descent. It was still relatively fast and slightly high crossing the threshold, on a short, wet runway with a tailwind that left almost no safety margin. Instead of breaking off and going around, the crew chose to land. Touchdown came very late. Instead of contacting the surface near the touchdown zone, the wheels met the pavement roughly 2/3 of the way along the 3,000-meter runway. That left only about 1,000 meters of wet concrete to bring a heavy jet, with a tailwind pushing it, from landing speed to a stop. Spoilers and reversers did deploy, but firm manual braking was delayed for a few seconds. On a dry, long runway, that would hardly matter. Here, those seconds were everything. From the cabin, passengers felt a firm landing, and then an uncomfortably long roll where the airplane did not seem to slow the way it should. Outside the cockpit windows, the far end of runway 06 rushed closer in darkness and rain. By the time the crew fully realized they were not going to stop on the pavement, the runway end lights were already under the nose. The 737 ran off the end at high speed. Beyond the concrete, the ground at Sabiha Gökçen does not fall gently away. There is a drop from the runway level down toward a perimeter road and a drainage area. The airplane left the pavement, dropped down the embankment, smashed through the localizer structure, and broke apart. The forward fuselage separated from the center section, and the tail broke away behind them. In seconds, the single tube of the cabin became 3 large pieces scattered beyond the runway end. Inside, the impact was violent and disorienting. Seats tore loose, overhead bins opened, lights failed. Some passengers suddenly found that the row in front of them was no longer there. Others looked out of the window and saw only mud, concrete, and torn metal. A fire broke out near one wing and engine, but did not immediately engulf the whole cabin, giving many people a narrow window to escape. Cabin crew and survivors opened intact exits and climbed out through breaks in the fuselage. Phone videos taken just afterward show passengers walking and running away from the wreckage in rain and darkness, while sirens and flashing lights close in from the runway above. 3 passengers died from their injuries. The other 180 occupants were taken to hospitals, most with some form of injury, but alive. The investigation pointed to a familiar pattern in runway disasters: a decision to continue an approach in weather at the edge of safe limits, a strong tailwind on a wet surface, an unstable approach not broken off with a go-around, a long landing, and delayed maximum braking on a runway that did not forgive any of those mistakes. It also highlighted systemic issues at a very busy low-cost hub, pressure to keep arrivals flowing, and the need for stricter rules on runway choice and tailwind limits in bad weather. Japan Airlines Flight 516 was one of the most watched landings in history, not because of the route, but because of what was waiting on its runway. It was the evening of January 2, 2024. Japan Airlines Flight 516, an Airbus A350 coming in from Sapporo, was on final approach to Tokyo Haneda. The New Year holidays were ending. The cabin was full of families, tourists, and business travelers heading back into the city. The weather was good for winter, clear enough to see the lights of Tokyo Bay and the terminals, dry runway, normal visibility. From a passenger's seat, nothing looked unusual at all. In the cockpit, the crew were flying a standard arrival. Air traffic control cleared them to land on one of Haneda's main runways, the long strip that runs out toward the water. Speeds and configuration were stable, the landing checklist was complete. This was the kind of big city arrival the crew had done hundreds of times. The real problem was not in the sky, it was already on the ground. At the same time, a Japan Coast Guard de Havilland -8 was preparing for an emergency mission. There had just been a major earthquake on the Noto Peninsula. The -8 was scheduled to carry supplies and personnel toward the disaster area. Its crew taxied out from the apron in low light, moving toward the same runway where Japan Flight was about to land. The tower gave the Coast Guard crew instructions to taxi and hold short near the runway. On the tapes released later, controllers repeatedly cleared Japan Airlines 516 to land, but never gave a clear takeoff clearance to the -8. Somewhere between what was said, what was heard, and what was understood in that cockpit, something broke. The crew of the -8 believed they were allowed to enter the runway for departure. The controller believed they were still holding clear of it. Haneda did not have a runway covered in fog or a thunderstorm that night. The danger was invisible. 2 different mental pictures of where one small aircraft was allowed to be. As Japan Flight descended toward the lights, the Coast Guard -8 rolled forward and lined up on the same runway. It was a much smaller aircraft, sitting low, with its lights partially masked by the background of the airport. From the airliner's cockpit, on short final at night, it would have been extremely hard to pick out a turboprop sitting near the runway centerline until the very last seconds. Inside the Airbus, passengers felt the gear come down, flaps extend, and then the familiar jolt as the main wheels touched the runway. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. Then, halfway through the landing roll, the A350 met something it should never have met: another aircraft. The left side of Japan Flight slammed into the -8 at high speed. The impact tore open the lower fuselage and wing of the Airbus. One of the engines disintegrated, fuel spilled and ignited. The Coast Guard aircraft was destroyed almost instantly, its wreckage thrown aside in a burst of fire. The Airbus lurched sideways, its nose yawing, then continued down the runway with its left side already on fire. From the cabin, the collision did not feel like one moment. It felt like chaos. People were thrown forward. Overhead, bins burst open. Within seconds, flames and thick black smoke were visible through windows on one side. The lights flickered. Oxygen masks did not drop because this was not a decompression at altitude. This was a fire on the ground, spreading fast. The pilots fought to keep the aircraft on what remained of the pavement, steering as long as they could. Eventually, the A350 slid to a stop further down the runway. nose slightly canted, one wing burning fiercely. Inside, the cabin crew had only seconds to make life-or-death decisions. They ordered an immediate evacuation. Some exits were unusable, blocked by fire or intense heat. Others became the only way out. Slides deployed into the darkness. Passengers rushed toward the lighted doorways, some still clutching bags despite shouting from the crew to leave everything behind. On video shot from the terminal, you can see a line of people sliding down, running away from the aircraft, while flames rise higher and smoke begins to pour from the fuselage. The fire did not die down, it grew. Within minutes, the entire upper fuselage was engulfed. Eventually, the A350 would burn almost down to its frame. Yet every one of the 379 people on board that aircraft escaped alive. Dozens were injured, some seriously, but all survived. On the Dash 8, the outcome was far worse. 5 of the 6 Coast Guard crew members were killed. Only the captain survived, badly injured. Investigators recovered the recorders and began to reconstruct the last minutes on the ground. The picture that emerged was not of a technical failure in the big jet, but of a textbook runway incursion. JAL 516 was properly cleared to land. The Dash 8 had been cleared only to taxi and hold short, but entered the runway anyway. There was no last-second radio call from the tower to warn the Japan Airlines crew, because the controller believed the runway was clear. The ground surveillance system that tracks aircraft and vehicles was working, but alarms and displays were not enough on their own to stop what was already in motion. Human factors sat at the center of the investigation. Phraseology used in the tower, how clear the instructions were to the Coast Guard crew, how cockpit workload and stress during an emergency mission may have affected what they heard and read back, and how controllers monitored runway occupancy at a time when the airport was very busy and Japan was responding to a national disaster. British Airways Flight 2276 was doing the most normal thing an airliner can do on a runway, starting its takeoff roll. It was the afternoon of September 8, 2015, at Las Vegas McCarran Airport. A British Airways Boeing 777 was getting ready to leave for London Gatwick as Flight 2276. The sun was still high, the desert air was hot, and from the terminal windows you could see the big twin-jet taxi out like any other long-haul departure. On board were holidaymakers heading home, business passengers settling in for an overnight flight, and a crew that had done this route many times before. The airplane lined up on the runway and held in position. In the cockpit, the crew completed the last checks. Thrust settings, speeds, departure route, all normal. When tower gave them clearance, the captain advanced the thrust levers. The 2 huge engines spooled up, and the 777 began to accelerate down the runway. In the cabin, nothing felt unusual. People heard the engines rise, felt the push into the seatback, and watched the runway lights and taxiway signs slide past faster and faster. This was the most routine moment in airline flying, the point where every flight begins. Then, just a few seconds after the takeoff roll really started, everything changed. On the left side of the airplane, one of the big engines suffered a violent failure. Inside the engine, a critical part in the compressor section broke apart. Metal fragments tore outward through the engine casing instead of staying contained. Hot pieces of metal cut into fuel and oil lines, and a massive fire erupted almost instantly around the left engine and wing root. From the cockpit, the crew heard a loud bang and felt a strong yaw as the 777 tried to pull left. Warning lights and alarms lit up. They were still below takeoff decision speed, the point known as V1, so the captain did what training demands. He rejected the takeoff. Thrust levers came back to idle, maximum braking went on, and the airplane decelerated hard, tires skidding and smoking under the heavy load. From inside the cabin, passengers felt a sudden change from steady acceleration to brutal braking. People who had started to relax back into their seats were thrown forward against belts and seatbacks. Some thought the aircraft had hit something on the runway. Others knew only that this was not how a normal takeoff felt. The 777 came to a stop on the runway, still pointed roughly down the center line. Outside on the left, the situation was already critical. Flames from the failed engine were licking up the side of the fuselage. Thick black smoke began to pour from under the wing. The heat started to scorch the paint and structure on that side of the aircraft. In the tower and on the ramp, controllers and ground crews saw the fire and immediately called for the airport's firefighting trucks. In the cockpit, the crew declared a mayday and pulled the engine fire handles. They shut down both engines and fired fire-extinguishing bottles into the left engine. The fire, however, was being fed by leaking fuel and had already spread beyond the nacelle. Time was now measured in seconds, not minutes. The captain ordered an evacuation. Inside the cabin, the call to evacuate cut through the confusion. Flight attendants jumped into action, shouting commands, assessing which exits were safe. On the left side, flames and smoke were visible through some windows, so those doors were kept closed. On the right side, where there was no fire, doors were opened and slides deployed down to the runway. Passengers scrambled to unbuckle, grab children, and move toward the exits. Despite instructions, some tried to take hand luggage, which slowed the flow and created dangerous bottlenecks at the doors. Still, the majority did what the crew told them: leave everything and get off the airplane. They slid down onto the hot tarmac, some falling, some twisting ankles or scraping skin, but alive. From the terminal, people watched an almost surreal scene. A modern wide-body jet sitting on the runway with one side engulfed in fire and smoke, and a line of passengers sliding down bright yellow chutes and running away into the open space between runway and taxiway. Airport fire crews reached the aircraft within minutes and attacked the blaze with foam. The fire was intense, but they managed to bring it under control before it burned through the entire fuselage. Even so, the damage to the left side of the 777 was catastrophic. The skin and structure near the wing root were charred and buckled. The engine was destroyed. Later inspections would show that the airplane was too badly damaged to economically repair. Remarkably, everyone on board survived. Around 40 people were injured, most of them with burns, smoke inhalation, or injuries from the rapid evacuation and slide landings, but there were no fatalities. For an aircraft that had been moments away from hurtling down the runway at full takeoff speed, that outcome was close to the best anyone could have hoped for, once the engine exploded. Investigators later traced the root cause to a critical engine component that had failed from a hidden material defect and fatigue, leading to an uncontained engine failure. They also examined how the crew handled the emergency and evacuation. Overall, the pilots were praised for rejecting the takeoff quickly and stopping the aircraft on the runway, and the cabin crew for getting everyone out despite the growing fire and the confusion of passengers trying to take bags. British Air Tours, Flight 28M shows how deadly a runway fire can be, even when the airplane never leaves the ground. It is the morning of August 22nd, 1985, at Manchester Airport. A British Air Tours Boeing 737 is getting ready to depart on a holiday charter to Corfu as Flight 28M. The mood on board is light. People are talking about beaches, drinks, and hotel transfers. The weather is good, visibility is fine, and from the cockpit this looks like a normal takeoff from a familiar runway. The 737 lines up and begins its takeoff roll. In the first seconds, nothing feels unusual. Engines roar, acceleration builds, the runway centerline slides under the nose. In the cabin, passengers feel themselves pushed back into the seats, some chatting, some already half asleep for the early departure. Then, just as the speed climbs toward the decision point, there is a loud bang from the left side. In the number one engine, a fan or compressor part fails and breaks apart. Hot metal punches through the engine casing instead of staying contained. Some of those fragments tear into the wing and fuel tank area. Fuel starts to leak and spray in the slipstream near the hot engine. Fire ignites almost at once. On the flight deck, the crew feel the yaw and hear the bang. Warning lights illuminate. They are still below the speed where they must continue, so the captain rejects the takeoff. Thrust levers come back, brakes go on hard, and the 737 slows rapidly on the runway. From the cabin, it feels violent but survivable. A strong push forward in the seatbelts, the sound of engines winding down, tires squealing, the sense that something has gone very wrong. The airplane comes to a stop on the runway. Inside the cockpit, the crew believe they are dealing with an engine fire that can be controlled. They shut down the engines and fire the extinguishers into the left engine. For a few seconds, it may look stable from their instruments. Outside, it is not. Flames are now burning under the left wing and along the fuselage. A light crosswind blows the fire and smoke against the left side of the cabin. Heat begins to attack the structure around the wing root and the cabin floor in that area. Within minutes, the outer skin and windows start to fail. Toxic smoke and flames push into the interior near the left overwing exits. The captain orders an evacuation. Cabin crew at the front open the forward right door and deploy the slide. Passengers rush toward it, some trying to grab bags, others simply pushing to get out. A bottleneck forms in the narrow aisle between the galley and the front doorway. People fall. Others climb over them. On the left side, the forward door is either not usable for long or leads directly into heavy fire. At the overwing exits, some passengers manage to open hatches, but others struggle with the mechanisms or become stuck in the opening. The wing itself is already being licked by flames from beneath. Inside the cabin, the fire breaks through more seriously. Thick, black, toxic smoke pours in from the left side around the overwing area and quickly fills the mid-cabin. Visibility collapses. People just a few rows back from an exit cannot see it anymore. Breathing becomes almost impossible in the worst part of the cabin. Many passengers are still strapped in, disoriented, unable to find a way out in the dark, hot smoke. Others manage to crawl along the floor toward light from the front or the rear, but the window of time is very short. On the outside, fire crews are racing toward the aircraft, but the fire is already intense. Flames punch out of windows on the left side. The roofline near the wing begins to deform. Rescuers can pull some people from doors and from the wing, but they cannot reach everyone before the smoke does. In the end, 55 people die, most not from burns, but from smoke inhalation in the cabin area just aft of the wing. Dozens more survive, many with injuries, burns, and long-term trauma. Looking at the wreck afterwards, investigators see something striking. The front and rear of the cabin are relatively intact, and many seats are untouched. The death zone is in the middle, where smoke and heat were trapped and where the exits were hardest to reach once the fire penetrated. The technical cause is clear enough: an uncontained engine failure that ruptured a fuel tank area and created a severe fire alongside the fuselage. The deeper lessons, though, are about what happens inside a cabin when that fire sits next to a parked airplane. Investigators and regulators study how long it took for the fire to break through, how quickly smoke filled the cabin, how interior materials burned, and what gases they released. They look at seat and wall coverings, carpets, side panels, and overhead bins. They analyze evacuation flow, why the aisle jammed at the forward right door, how people behaved at overwing exits, how long it took to empty the aircraft compared to the 90-second certification target. The changes that come out of British Air Tour's Flight 28M are huge. Cabin materials are required to be far more fire-resistant and to produce less toxic smoke. Floor-level emergency lighting and clearer exit signs become standard, so people can find their way out when the cabin is filled with smoke a meter above the floor. Training for cabin crew is updated to emphasize redirecting passengers quickly if one exit becomes blocked, and to keep aisles clear of bags and bodies as much as possible. Overwing exit designs are reviewed so that untrained passengers can open them more quickly and safely. Runway safety training also starts using this accident as a primary example of why a rejected takeoff with a major fire is still a life-threatening emergency, not a safe stop. The airplane may be standing still, but the clock is ticking just as hard as if it were in the air.